Okay, so we are approaching our last lesson for this course, and we're going to speak about something which is probably one of the most profound topics in Hasidic philosophy, and we are actually approaching this topic for a while already. We've been speaking about the nature of creation and how the relationship between creation and the Creator, and how that relationship doesn't make a change in the Creator. So, in section 6, Tzemach Tzedek will quote, he will continue to speak about this godly energy being most similar to the concept of light. And based on the foundations we have laid down in the previous section, which are that on one hand, this is God acting, it's not an independent medium of God. On the other hand, God doesn't change because of this action. And why doesn't it change? Because it's like ore, it's like a reflection, and this reflection is almost like automatic. At the same time, it is automatic, but it's not without God's will. It's God who decides to reflect or not to reflect, similar to the soul which animates the body. The soul animates the body automatically, but not unwillingly. It's not forced to animate the body. So really the question is, and Michael asked the question about Ein Sof and Or Ein Sof, just the end of the last lesson. So, we see that there is a concept of infinity and a concept of finity. Is there a word like that? There's infinity. Finitude. So there is a concept of infinity and the concept of finitude. Ein Sof, or Ein Sof, the infinite light being the Bilti Bal Gvul, the thing which is the ultimate unlimitation. And then there is Gvul, there is the limitation. And really we see this idea in our existence. We see in our existence, and we went through this in a way, in everything we see Or Vekli. We see in everything a light, a more untangible force, and we see the body, we see the kalim, we see the specification in which this light or this energy reveals itself in. And Kabbalah has a description actually a pretty short description of how the creation comes to be. And we will start with reading this little description that is quoted here in the Derech Mitzvosecha in section 6. And we will try to understand through this description, this phenomena of infinity and finitude. Okay, so let's go on page 1 in section 6. The order through which the world is brought into being from God was revealed to us by God through our prophets and the holy sages of blessed memory, as was recorded by the Arizal, through whom the Spirit of God spoke. So this, what we are going to read, is more or less a word-for-word quotation from the Eitz Chaim, companion of teachings of the Arizal, where he describes just in a few lines what are the first steps of creation. So he says like this: when it arose in his simple will to create the world, he contracted his essence in a central point and left vacant and evenly measured place on all the sides. This is called a vacuum and the empty space. Only a reshimu, a trace, remained from the light that originally existed. Nevertheless, the light was not reduced, God forbid. It was merely moved to the sides. Then God drew down a thin kav, a vector of light, a measure of light, into the empty cavity, and all the existence was brought into being through it. Okay? These are the quotes from the Arizal. So let me give again the example which we used before. From a teacher. So we said, now we know what reflection and shefa and all that, we know that. So now let's see the teacher, the master. He's an extremely smart guy, a genius. He has a lot of deep thoughts in his mind. Now he wants to speak to someone specific. So he wants to specify these ideas, right? Let's imagine he has an unlimited, infinite number of ideas that they themselves are also infinite. Now he needs to speak to someone to explain a certain topic. So he needs to, it's similar to God, who has an infinite reflection, and he decides to create. When he decides to create, what does he need to do? So when the master makes a decision, he wants to teach, what's the first thing he needs to do? We said this is the idea of tzimtzum. He says here, he contracted his essence. It doesn't mean his essence, it means his light. It's important. So what does the master do? He contracts the ideas that are in his head. He shoves them aside. He needs to say, quiet, quiet, quiet. Okay, let's put all that aside. And he creates an empty space in his mind. Okay? Now, in this phase, he contracts, but he doesn't contract his essence. He contracts his essential light. He contracts his reflection. He doesn't contract himself. He himself doesn't become stupider. He just empties out the ideas from his head. But he still knows these ideas. They're just not reflected in his mind. What happens then? There is created an empty space. And the creation will be created into this empty space. But how does the creation happen then? After he contracted and shoved aside his essential light, there was left something from the light. It's like, imagine a space is filled with something. The space is filled with dirty water. You pour out the water. Now you have an empty container. But there's still some traces of the thing which was there before in the container. So there's some little dirt left there. So he has this light in his mind, these lofty ideas in his mind. He shoves them aside. These lofty ideas are so lofty, they are not even complied in words or sentences. They're just these lofty things, like imaginary. Sometimes when you have these deep thoughts in your mind, you're not bringing them down to think of them in a course of words or sentences. They are hollow in your mind. And then you say, okay, let's take them aside. Something will be left over there. Something in your mind still your mind won't be totally empty. Try to empty your mind. Let's say, I want to give a different example. Let's say you're thinking of something very intensively. You're thinking of a problem very intensively. And somebody comes to you and it's very hard to imagine this because it's very hard for us to empty our minds. We usually say, if I think of something, the only way I can take that thing away if I start thinking of something else. But no, there is a way to empty your mind almost fully, right? For example, a little bit is like my understanding of like Far East meditations. What is it? You start to mumble something. You start to mumble, and when you mumble this thing, it's like you're concentrating on something so simple that everything that was in your mind is like just empties out. So you're able to empty your mind. But what happens when you empty your mind? It's not easy. But if you're thinking intensively about something with all its complexity, and you empty your mind, still some traces of what you were thinking of will stay in your mind. So you think of a whole, let's say you're busy now with renovating your house. It's a complex idea. You have to do this, you have to do blah, 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 blah. You're thinking about it, and it makes your mind busy, and you say, let's empty my mind. But one thing will stay in your mind. The Wi-Fi, what's it called? Water heater. So it's just few gibberish words. There's no life to it, and somebody will tell you. So what's in your mind? You'll say some gibberish. You won't be able to give like a whole explanation, but just these few traces, almost of unmeaningful letters and words, will stay on the surface of the container in your mind.
Not just a few. You can't empty your mind. I can't.
Yeah. It's not easy. And what we're saying is, it's not easy, and if you do it, it won't be fully empty. There will be some traces will be left.
And even you have to concentrate to keep yourself in that level.
Yeah, it's not easy. It just happens for a second. Now, why is it that what you're going to be left with is these little letters and words in your mind that don't really have a meaning? Before you emptied your mind, you were not thinking in terms of words. You were thinking of these lofty concepts. You were thinking in concepts, not in words, right? There's two ways to think. There's a way to think like you prepare yourself for what am I going to say to my boss? I'm going to sit there, I'm going to say it. I almost think over literally the sentences. It's almost like I'm speaking in my mind. That's the type of thinking when you're thinking in words and letters. There's a different type of thinking when you're thinking concepts, imaginary concepts. They are not. You don't need to say the whole thing. You just think of a concept. Now, when the higher, the more lofty, the less complied or described concept you're thinking of, you're going to be thinking more on a level of imaginary concepts and not on the level of words and letters. And still, now you're emptying your mind from these lofty concepts. What are you left with? Little letters and words. So it seems like even when you had this infinite concepts in your mind, they had some type of letters because they are the ones that are left there. It's like water. Water seems like there's nothing in it. It seems empty. It seems colorless. And then you pour out water, and there's little the stones of the water stone. That what it's called? Water stone? Viskö? How you call it? What is it called? Lime scale left on the side of the cup. So you see, there was something in it, but when the water filled the cup, you didn't realize it because it was so overwhelming, just the water, that you didn't see that there is a element to it, which is this lime. So too, when you think in concepts, when there's an infinite light that fills your brain, you're not thinking in words, although there is some type of words or letters in the concept. You're not thinking of it because the light is so overwhelming. But when you take away the light, suddenly there is this traces of something. Just one second. I'm trying to think of another example. But basically, the idea is that when the light is very strong, you don't realize the physical aspect of the light. So when the concept is very strong, you don't realize the physical aspect of light. Imagine now in a level of emotions. You have a very intense emotion. We explained yesterday that when a poet writes a poem, so first he has a very strong feeling, when he has that very strong feeling, he still cannot write, right? He needs to move away a bit, needs to calm down, the feeling needs to be less intense, and then he could express, right? Now imagine you have a very strong emotion, and you're making a tzimtzum in that emotion, in that intense emotion, and you're saying, if there was a way to do it, I'm not sure there's a way to do it, but let's say you're very intensely emotional, and you can't even explain what you're feeling, it's so intense, like when in our metaphor, when the brick fell on your head, you're not even able to explain what you're feeling. You need a few days to calm down, to have a little bit less intense, and then you're able to write even a poem about it. But now you're in the status of being, in the state of being having a very intense emotion. Now let's imagine somebody would go and whoops, and take away that emotion, the intense emotion. You will be left with some meaningless traces, some gibberish. Like, so these meaningless gibberish shows that although you were not able to yet put your feeling in words, there were already traces of words and letters that were embedded in that intense feeling. So, let's go to God. God has an infinite light. And God takes away that light in order to create an empty space for the creation. When He takes away that light, there is left something there. And that something is the gibberish letters and words that will be refilled with godly light and will be able to then be alive words and sentences as a medium for creation. Similarly, let's get back to the poem. You have the poet and the poem. You have a very intense feeling. You take away that feeling because you can't. While you have that intense feeling, you can't express yourself. You know, in order to express yourself, you need to calm down. You are in hysteria now. Somebody's in hysteria. He can't even say what he's feeling. He's in hysteria. So first you need to calm down. Hey man, calm down, calm down. You calm down. You clean the hysteria out of your mind. There's some gibberish words, and you see that in the process. By the way, when somebody starts explaining what he went through, he's just saying like words that sometimes don't even make sense. He was, and I was, and he was, and he can't even express himself in sentences. These words are the gibberish which is left after you took away that intense feeling. But whatever you're going to end up in a day from now to write the poem about your experience is going to be based on this gibberish. It's just this gibberish will be built up and broadened and made into sentences that make sense. I don't know if this process made sense the way I explained it, but I hope it did. You want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say that it depends of the imager also. What kind of imager you are know?
Imager?
Imager.
Like to imagine something? What type of character you have? Yeah, definitely. Look, we're not using these examples in order to mainly to understand the human character. We're just using it as a metaphor for the godly process. So in the human character, obviously these things don't exactly work this way. We're using it as a metaphor. It's not a literal description of how this works by a poem or a poet. But we see, so this is the idea of God. He has this infinite light. He wants to create, so he pushes away this infinite light. There is left some gibberish there. And then he brings the light again into this gibberish and creates alive, animate words and sentences out of it. And these are the Sefirot. Okay? But what do I see? I see that the traces, the Kasdamein, how would you say Kasdamein in English? The initial traces that you start working with were already included in the light. It's the same way when you explain something you had an intense feeling of. When you have the intense feeling, you feel like there's no words that can express it. When the intensity of the feeling evaporates, you're left with some words to explain what you went through. Where did these words come from? They came from that intense feeling. They came from the light. So and now, these words are the first traces of finitude. The feeling is the metaphor for infinity. The words are the metaphor for finitude. Where did finitude come from? It came also from the infinite light. So, it's a little hard maybe to understand this, but so you had the infinite light, because the question is, if God is infinite, where did finitude come from? Right? God is infinite and we are finite. There has to be the attribute of finitude in God, because otherwise, where did we come from? This is the same question or the same topic that we were discussing till now, more or less, but just from a different flip side. We see that there is a finite creation. Who created it? An infinite existence. But where does this finitude come from? Finitude and infinity are, per definition, a contradictory concept. So if he is infinite, he's not finite. So then how can he create things that are finite? So then what's the answer to this? The finitude, which ultimately constitutes in the finite creation, its first initial traces are included in infinity. So there's a Kabbalistic term which goes like this. I think it goes, Atzmus umahus, the essence of God, Kshem sheyesh lo koyach bebilti ba'al gvul, the same way it has the capacity of infinity, yesh lo koyach begvul. It has the capacity of finitude. V'hagvul hanimtza mimeno rishon, and the first manifestation of finitude is the tzimtzum, is the what's the word for tzimtzum? Contraction of his light. The contraction of his light and these leftover traces which are called the shimum. So we're saying something huge here. We're saying God, on the ultimate level of infinity, is not only infinite, but also has the capacity for finitude. So it's like saying, God, there is the essence of God, Atzmus. This essence has a potential for infinity. That's the light that comes out of him. That's his reflection. And also has the potential for finitude. How does infinity manifest itself and how does finitude manifest itself? Infinity manifests itself by the ray of light that is reflected out of him, his reflection. And the finitude manifests itself by doing the tzimtzum in the light. And that with this we explain our question, where does finitude come from? It comes also from him. Not an easy concept to understand, but this is the main point. So, when we say about tzimtzum, we say that he contracted his light. So this is a major topic in Kabbalah and in Hasidus, the description of contraction. Contraction is the word for tzimtzum?
Yeah. Sometimes withdrawal, but it depends when you emphasize it.
The tzimtzum arishin, the first tzimtzum is more like a withdrawal, but it's a little harder to express it in English, so I'll say just contraction, tzimtzum. So the idea of tzimtzum kepshutoi, or tzimtzum is einoi kepshutoi, loi kepshutoi. Is tzimtzum a literal process of contraction or not literal? Literal, I can't express it. Literal. Is it sosarinti? Why not sosarinti? Is it kepshuto or not kepshuto? Should we take it literally or not? And obviously, the conclusion of this discussion is that the tzimtzum, the contraction, is not literal. God doesn't become less, and even His light doesn't become less. It's a similar concept to what we spoke till now. God doesn't change, right? So God doesn't become less. When He contracts His light in the beginning of creation, that actually doesn't make Him less, and in essence, it doesn't even make His light less. Then what is the idea of contraction? If you shove it aside, it was all over, and now it's not all over, so it does become less. So in order to understand this, we will read a little bit. Seemingly, look at page 3, section 6. Seemingly, the tzimtzum represents a great change. A resolution can, however, be offered based on the explanation in section 5 regarding the term or. This term refers to the ray that radiates forth from him. Look on page 4, a little bit below the middle. It is within this infinite light that the tzimtzum took place, and not within God's essence, or heaven forbid. You understand? So what it's saying is, tzimtzum is a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is not a tzimtzum in him. The tzimtzum is a tzimtzum in his light. Therefore, it doesn't change him. Ultimately, we will say it doesn't even change his light. The same way we said that the light gets enclosed in the attributes. It doesn't change the light. It only is a change for the perceiver, not for the light. But first, to explain this, he says, to explain the tzimtzum, it is necessary first to understand that the potential of ray, which is called Ein Sof, to extend outward from him, is actually an infinite potential without any limit or end. Just his essence is unlimited. His light is also unlimited. I'm just trying to... It's a very complicated topic. I'm just trying to take out the most out of it and not to confuse you guys. You know what? I think we're going to stop here because it's just not. I'm going to repeat now what we said, and I'm going to just say one more thing out of the whole thing which is written here, just for Michael's sake, because he keeps on coming back to this idea of Ein Sof. But first, just so what we're saying here basically is that to summarize, God is ultimately the ultimicity, is that such a word? Ultimicity of simplicity. He's one, he's undescribable, he's infinite, and he creates a finite creation. How does this happen? It happens through his light. The reason why we say it happens through his light, because we want to explain that it doesn't change him, right? That was our whole discussion. It doesn't change him because the same way the light doesn't change the source of light, no matter how far the light goes or doesn't go, or what it creates or doesn't create, so to God, the infinite God, the energy that comes out of God, doesn't doesn't make a change back into the source of light, into God. We said also this light is infinite the same way God himself is infinite. The energy is simple and infinite just like God himself is simple and infinite. How does the finitude come into the place, the specification of this light, of this energy, that it creates you, it creates me, it creates the chair. They are all specific things. Well, it comes from the Sephirot. It comes from these attributes that are medium. Oh, okay, well, where do these mediums come from? They also have to come from somewhere. And we ended up saying, yes, they ultimately also come from the light. They come from the contraction of light. When you contract the light, there will be some traces left there, and these traces can then later serve as a medium for the light again to be in a specific, to get a certain specification. So that ultimately means that God's light, which is infinite, has in it also the capacity of the potential for finitude. And actually, yes, we say, yeah, God has not only his light, he himself has the capacity, the potential for infinite and for finite as well. What is the manifestation of his infinity? His infinite reflection. What is the manifestation of his finitude? The tzimtzum, the contraction, which happens in the light, and the traces of oises or shimu, of these gibberish letters that stay over after he shoves aside the light, conceals the light. So that's the two forces in him, the infinite and the finite. And the truth of the matter is, what he says here later, that when we say infinite, we use the term, and so far we always use that term for God. He's infinite. So what's the term we use in Hebrew? We say Ein Sof, which means no end. He's endless. But the truth is, why don't we use the expression Ein Lo Yitchila? He has no beginning. That would be a much better term to describe it, because no end means there is a beginning, just no end. If there's a beginning, then it's not fully infinite. Why do we use the term Ein Lo Tchila? He has no beginning. So Chassidus says, the truth of the matter is, you know what? You cannot even say Ein Sof for God himself, his essence. God's essence, it's not true to say about it Ein Sof, no end. It would much more make sense to say about him Ein Lo Tchila and Ein Lo Sof. He has no beginning and no end. And in many liturgy texts, he's, for example, in Adon Olam, one of the first prayers we say in our morning prayers, which is complied by a Kabbalist, we do say that. We say Bli Reishis V'li Sachlis, without a beginning and without an end. We describe it this way. So that's the way to really, that would be the best to speak about the Atzmus, the essence. When we say Ein Sof, we don't really mean his essence. We mean his reflection. Now, his reflection, person's reflection. Let's look at a person. You have the person and you have his reflection. You can't really divide them, because any existence, because it exists, it has a reflection. There is nothing which doesn't have a reflection. So you can't really take it apart. But still, there is the essence of the thing and its reflection. And the beginning of the reflection starts from the essence. So it has a beginning, it just doesn't have an end, in the case of God. Your reflection has an end, because you're not endless. But you are a limited existence, so your reflection is also limited. God's reflection is unlimited, is infinite. But it is not something which doesn't have a beginning. It has a beginning, and that's the source of light. That's God himself. God himself, though, doesn't have a beginning. Got it? So God himself is Ein Lo Itchila Ve'Ein Lo Tichla. He doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end. But his reflection has a beginning, that's God himself, and doesn't have an end because it reflects God, which doesn't have an end. Okay? Now, so that means that when we speak about Ein Sof, that's already a certain reflection. And there's two levels in this reflection, Ein Sof and Or Ein Sof. The endless and the endless light. What are those two? We're not going to get into that. But there's two levels in reflection. God himself, though, Atzmus, which is essence, that is so undescribable, you cannot say no end, no beginning. You can't say anything about it. Anything you're going to say, you're already describing it. Even with a negative description, you're describing it. Now there's one thing we must say, that ultimately, this essence cannot be even limited by saying that it's unlimited. Because when you say that it's unlimited, you're already limiting him, right? You have to say he is limited and also unlimited. He's not limited or unlimited. He has the potential to be limited the same way he has a potential to be unlimited. In the case of this essence, both are brought forward. Both potentials are brought forward. And one is brought forward by the unlimitation, and one is brought forward by limitation. One is brought forward by infinity, and one is brought forward by finitude. And so when we see in the creation an infinite energy behind everything, and we also see a specification in everything, the truth of the matter is they both come from this essence of God. The source of one is the infinite light of God. The source of the other, the source of the specification, the limitation, is the potential for finitude. I think it's a pretty cool explanation, because it basically is saying God is, and you have to be very careful with this, because if you say God is limited the same way he's unlimited, if you take this to and you don't add the words, he has the potential to be limited the same way he has a potential to be unlimited, you're going to run into heresy. You're saying God is limited. So for example, this is, theologically, I'm not going to name, but other religions say, there's no problem to say that God comes in a form of a person and he gets to be limited, because he's not limited to being unlimited. But we're not saying that. We're saying God's essence doesn't become not unlimited and not limited. It's all his reflections that are either unlimited or limited. He himself, the God that you serve, doesn't become limited. He has the potential to be unlimited or limited. But that's ultimately the answer. And this is something which is so beautiful, because really in every existence, if you break down any existence, you're able to break it down to this contradictory completeness of limitation and unlimitation, to light and to body, to soul and to body, everything has this double identity. Any existence has this double identity of body and soul, of infinite light and finite expression. Everything has this double identity, and it's such a contradiction in itself. In existence itself, there is this contradiction, and then we find this contradiction in creation. On one hand, God creates a limited world, an infinite God creates a finite world. How does that happen? So we end up saying, this both concepts of infinity and finitude originate in God's essence that cannot be limited not to limitation and also not to illimitation.
Sorry, just a question.
Yes.
You mentioned the Adon Olam.
Yeah.
There is also it's written that and when everything will be end. So there will be a point, or how can I?
Yes, it says, I just want to quote it literally, yeah? So he says, when everything will end, he will be still ruling. So the way it works is, he says, I'm sorry for my very primitive translation, the ruler, the master of the universe which has ruled, even before any creation was created. And at the point when he wished, he made everything. Then he became a king. He was called then a king, because his creatures related to him as a king. And when everything will be over, he will still he will still rule on by himself. This is an idea of what the Rambam says, that when you want to describe the infinite existence of God, which we call Metziusoi Matzmusoi, which its existence is from itself. Yes, we said every created creature is existent, dependent on something. God's existence is independent. Its existence is from itself, not from something else. So when you want to describe this, you say like this: God is the source of all beings, and if God would be taken away, so-called, and if nothing else would be there, but if everything would be taken away, God would still be there. His existence is not dependent on the existence of others. And that's what the term means. After everything will finish, he will still be ruling. The meaning is, his existence is not dependent on the existences that constitute from him. That doesn't mean necessarily that there will be a state when there will be nothing. It's just
a metaphor,
it's a metaphor, and it's like, in theory, you want to explain how independent his existence is. So imagine that there was nothing. Although it says, by the way, it does say that in certain places, but we don't know exactly what it means. It says that there will be a state when everything will be vanished. But we don't know what it. So it says, I think either in the Talmud or in the Zohar, Shis alfei shnim have kaima alma. There's 6,000 years that the world will stand. V'chat charuf, and one it will then be vanished. And what does this mean? This is, by the way, the source of the idea that we are holding right now at 5,782, and Messiah will come definitely before the 7th. We entered into the 7th millennium. But he doesn't say it this way. He just says 6,000 years the world will stand, and one it will be vanished. So there is certain sources you can explain that the existence came to be, and it will also be vanished. But I don't know what that means. I think it's more in a theological sense to say that God's ultimate independent existence doesn't depend on anything. So if there would be nothing outside of him, he would still be.
It's interesting, though, at least in a poetic sense, Levado Yimloich Naira. So a melech
Needs
existence.
Right.
The concept of melech is always a relationship.
Right.
Somebody who rules over. So to say that B'terem Kol Yitzim, he was a melech even before there were servants, and he's going to be a melech even after.
It's a very good question. It's a very good philosophical question, logical question.
Yeah, because even there it says, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra. So in other words, the term, he was only called Melech
Is only
when
that.
there were existences. So then the word applied. But just because
I think the word melech here means a ruler, an independent ruler. The idea of independent ruler is that there is no force outside of him that he's depending on. So in the case of melech, this is before there is creations and after there is creations. Melech means a ruler. Means he's a ruler. He continues to be a ruler. He's not going to be any less strong or anything because there's nothing else outside of him. Look at the king. This is the idea. Look at a king. A king is a ruler, but he's a ruler that needs the people. So if the people would arise against the king, ultimately they will throw him off his throne, right? So he, on one hand, he's an ultimate ruler. There's no limitations to it. He can do whatever he wants. Omar Malka Akar Tura. The king gives out a decree. The king gives out a decree, even to move away a whole hill. That will happen. They will take it away because he has such a strong rule. There's nothing, but at the same time, what happens, if he overdoes it, people will rise against him. So it means, on one hand, his people are dependent on him, but he's also dependent on his people. And therefore, God is not a ruler in that sense. He's only Melech Shemoi Nikra Aleim. He's only called a God, but he's not a God in the sense that he's dependent on his people. And therefore, he rules even before there is people, even before there is creation, even after there is creation. Only that when there is creation, he's called a king. But his kingship is not the type of kingship like when we see in a relationship between creatures. So the point is, when you speak in authority, so in every system, there is authority, right? There is lower, higher. That's how we put things in system. So you say, if I'm higher, I'm stronger than you. But at the same time, since it's a system, I am part of the system. You don't have any authority which is independent, which is so strong that is independent of everything else. You still need to be part of the system, which means you have to lihikana, how you say, you have to give in to the system. The highest authority is also dependent on the system. God is outside of the system. So therefore, he is a ruler in a way, he rules the system in a way that he's not dependent on the system. And that's, by the way, our discussion here. How can he be a creator of finite things when he is infinite? How can he be a ruler of a system when he's outside of the system? And that's the thing that we cannot understand about God. He is the ruler of the system, but he's not dependent on the system. Yes.
I also hear in the Kabbalah Shavas,